Trench Warfare Explained, WWI's Brutal Reality. When the Earth Learned to Swallow Men. It is quiet at first, not the comforting kind of quiet, but the heavy, listening kind. The kind where the air feels like it's waiting for something terrible to happen. Somewhere in northern France, before dawn, the ground is damp and breathing fog. Mud clings to boots, coats, thoughts. A man shifts his weight, and the earth sucks at his feet like it wants him back. Above him, the sky is still undecided about rain. Below him, the trench walls sweat slowly, oozing chalk and clay, collapsing just a little more every day. This is not a battlefield in the heroic sense. There are no sweeping charges yet, no trumpets, no clean lines. There is just a ditch, a long, ugly ditch, and men living inside it, trying not to die. If you had told anyone in 1914 that the most advanced industrial nations on Earth would spend 4 years digging holes and hiding in them, they would have laughed. Politely, of course. Then they would have adjusted their mustaches and explained modern warfare to you. Railroads would decide battles. Artillery would break armies in days. Wars would be short, decisive, elegant in their brutality. Everyone would be home by Christmas. Which Christmas was never entirely clear, but optimism rarely bothers with details. And yet, here we are, knee-deep in mud, surrounded by rats that have grown fat on the dead, listening to shells scream overhead like the sky itself is tearing apart. This is trench warfare. Not because anyone wanted it, not because it was clever, but because once the killing started, nobody knew how to stop it. To understand how Europe ended up living underground, we have to step back for a moment, away from the mud and the wire and the smell, back to a continent that believed, genuinely believed, that progress had solved war. Europe in the early 20th century was confident in the way only comfortable civilizations are. Empires stretched across maps like permanent features of nature. Industry hummed. Cities glowed with electric light. Science promised solutions to everything from disease to distance. War, if it came, would be fast, controlled, rational, as if violence ever cared about being rational. The generals had plans. Oh, they always have plans. They were beautifully drawn, meticulously timed, and completely disconnected from reality. Armies would mobilize like clockwork. Infantry would advance with discipline and courage. Artillery would soften defenses. Cavalry would exploit breakthroughs. It was all very neat on paper. Unfortunately, paper does not shoot back. When war erupted in the summer of 1914, it came fast and loud. Mobilizations triggered counter-mobilizations. Alliances snapped into place like falling dominoes. Trains packed with soldiers rolled toward borders, while civilians waved flags and threw flowers. There was singing, there was cheering. There was a sense that history was happening somewhere else to someone else and would surely be over soon. The opening months were violent, chaotic, and astonishingly wasteful. Armies collided along borders with a ferocity that shocked even those who had planned for it. Rifles were accurate at distances previous wars never imagined. Machine guns turned open fields into killing grounds in seconds. Artillery shells didn't just kill, they erased. Men vanished into smoke and fragments, leaving behind nothing that resembled a human shape. Still, the belief persisted that one decisive push would end it. So they pushed, and pushed again, and again, until something strange happened. The advances slowed, not because courage ran out, there was no shortage of that, but because defense had quietly, brutally become stronger than offense. When infantry charged across open ground, machine guns waited patiently. When cavalry tried to maneuver, artillery tore them apart. When one side gained ground, the other simply dug in and refused to move. And so, almost by accident, armies began carving the earth. Shallow at first, scrapes really, just enough to hide from bullets. But bullets kept coming, and shells, so the scrapes became trenches, and the trenches became systems, and the systems stretched for hundreds of miles. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, the Western Front hardened into a scar across the continent. Two vast armies faced each other, not separated by honor or negotiation, but by mud, wire, and a strip of land so dangerous it earned a name whispered with dread: No Man's Land, which is a poetic way of saying, if you go there, you probably won't come back. Life in the trenches was not a constant battle. That would almost have been easier. It was instead a slow, grinding routine of discomfort, fear, and waiting. Long hours of boredom punctuated by moments of absolute terror. Soldiers learned the rhythms of the front the way farmers learn weather. Morning stand to when attacks were most likely, repairing parapets, clearing water, killing lice. Always the lice. They crawled into seams, hair, thoughts. Men scratched until skin broke. It was intimate misery, shared by thousands. Then there was the mud. It deserves its own mention because it was practically a character in the war. Rain turned trenches into canals, boots disappeared, men slipped and drowned in shell holes filled with brown water. Horses vanished, equipment rusted, corpses sank slowly, becoming part of the walls that living men leaned against. The earth did not care who you were, it swallowed everyone equally. Rats thrived, large, bold, unashamed. They fed on scraps and bodies alike. Soldiers named them, cursed them, tried to shoot them for sport. It didn't help. The rats always came back, like the war itself. And above all of this hung the sound, the constant background roar of artillery, day and night, sometimes distant, like thunder that never quite arrives, sometimes close enough to punch the air out of your lungs. Shell shock, they called it later, when men began shaking, stuttering, staring into nothing. At the time, it was often treated as weakness, as if the human nervous system was supposed to be immune to living inside an earthquake for years. Every so often, orders came down. An attack was planned. The men knew what that meant. They'd heard the stories. They'd seen the aftermath. Still, when the whistles blew, they climbed ladders and went over the top. Not because they believed in glory, but because everyone else was doing it. Because staying behind felt worse. Because hope, however irrational, is stubborn. They walked into machine gun fire. Sometimes they ran. Sometimes they fell immediately. Sometimes they reached the enemy trench, stunned and shaking, and fought face to face with bayonets and fists and fear. Gains were measured in yards, losses in thousands. And after it was over, if it was over, the survivors dug in again, a little farther forward, or not at all. This was the brutal reality of trench warfare. Not a single moment of horror, but an accumulation of them. A system that rewarded endurance more than brilliance. A war where survival depended less on heroism than on luck. Which shell landed where, which moment you stood up, which day the rain came. And as the months turned into years, technology escalated the nightmare. Barbed wire thickened until it resembled metallic forests. Artillery grew larger, more precise, more relentless. Poison gas drifted across the trenches in pale clouds, burning lungs and eyes, turning breath itself into an enemy. Masks helped sometimes, panic didn't. And still, the lines held, because for every new weapon, someone found a way to dig deeper, stronger bunkers, better trench designs. Defense kept pace with destruction. The war became a stalemate, not because nobody tried hard enough, but because everyone tried too hard in the wrong ways. Somewhere in all of this, the original reasons for fighting faded. Men no longer talked about alliances or national pride. They talked about home, about food, about sleep, about how much longer this could possibly last. The war had become its own reason, a machine fed by momentum, fear, and the terrible logic of sunk cost. Too much had already been lost to stop now, as if losing more would somehow make it worthwhile. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the guns paused and the night settled in, something else crept through the trenches: humanity. Soldiers on opposite sides heard each other coughing, singing, praying. Sometimes, incredibly, they stopped shooting for an hour, a day, a Christmas. Proof that the war was not inevitable, even if it felt that way. But those moments never lasted. Orders returned. The architecture of survival. By the second winter, the trenches were no longer improvised ditches scratched into panic-soaked soil. They had become architecture. Ugly, pragmatic, endlessly repaired architecture. The kind that exists not to inspire, but simply to keep you alive for one more night. If you could step back and look at the Western Front from above, ignoring the shell craters and smoke, you would see something resembling a scarred nervous system. Lines behind lines behind lines. Frontline trenches, support trenches, reserve trenches, all connected by narrow communication trenches that twisted like veins to avoid giving snipers a clean shot. Nothing straight, nothing simple. Geometry had learned fear. The front line trench was the worst of it. That was where you stood closest to the enemy, sometimes less than a football field away, sometimes close enough to hear them talk when the wind was right. The parapet, the wall facing the enemy, was built high and thick, reinforced with sandbags, timber, and anything else that could stop bullets or shrapnel, or at least slow them down. The parados behind you protected from shells falling short. In between was a narrow corridor of mud, duckboards, and bodies trying to not think too hard about where they were standing. You didn't stand whenever you wanted. That was how you got shot. You learned quickly to crouch, to move low, to keep your head below the parapet unless absolutely necessary. Periscopes became prized possessions. A stick with mirrors felt like advanced technology when the alternative was losing half your face. Snipers were always watching, always patient. They didn't need many shots, just the right one. Behind the front lines sat the support trenches, slightly less miserable, which is not the same as comfortable. This is where men waited when they weren't actively holding the line, where supplies were stacked, where wounded men crawled or were carried back, hoping the shelling didn't start again before they reached help. Farther still were the reserve trenches, theoretically safer, though artillery had a way of ignoring theory. Living underground changed people. Days blurred together. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by bombardments, sentry duty, or the sudden realization that something was crawling across your face. The smell was constant. Damp earth, unwashed bodies, rot, cordite. Latrines overflowed. Disease spread quietly. Trench foot turned flesh white and numb, then black and dead, forcing amputations that felt almost merciful by comparison. And yet, people adapted, because humans always do. Soldiers decorated dugouts with scraps of home, photos, bits of writing. Someone learned to brew tea from whatever water hadn't been contaminated yet. Someone else learned how to cook something resembling food on a tiny stove. Jokes circulated, dark ones mostly. Humor became a survival mechanism. Laughing at the absurdity of it all was sometimes the only way to keep from screaming. Above ground, generals struggled with a problem they barely understood. How do you break an enemy that refuses to move? The answer, over and over again, was artillery. If you can't outmaneuver them, pulverize them. So they fired shells in numbers previously unimaginable, days-long barrages that churned the landscape into something lunar. The idea was simple: destroy the trenches, kill the defenders, cut the wire, then send the infantry forward to occupy the ruins. In practice, it rarely worked that way. Shells buried trenches instead of destroying them. Defenders hid in deep dugouts and emerged when the barrage lifted. Barbed wire, maddeningly resilient, often remained intact. And when the attackers advanced, exhausted and disoriented, machine guns reappeared like ghosts and resumed their work. The ground gained was measured in yards. The cost was measured in lives that would never be lived. No Man's Land became a place of nightmares, a strip of land neither side truly controlled, cratered and torn apart by constant shelling. Corpses lay where they fell, sometimes for months, slowly blending into the mud. At night, patrols crept out to repair wire, listen to enemy movements, or retrieve wounded men who might still be alive. The darkness was thick. Every sound felt like a threat. Flares burst overhead without warning, bathing the landscape in harsh white light, freezing men in place as machine guns opened up blindly. Attacks usually came at dawn. There was a reason for that: low light, tired defenders, hope for surprise. The men knew the routine. Whistles blew, ladders went up, and then, like clockwork, they climbed out. Some prayed, some cursed, some felt nothing at all. Fear can exhaust itself if given enough time. Once out in the open, training dissolved into chaos. Smoke obscured everything. Orders were impossible to hear. Men advanced by instinct, by the movement of those beside them. When they fell, others stepped around them. Not out of cruelty, but necessity. Stopping meant dying too. Occasionally, attacks succeeded. A trench was taken, prisoners were captured. For a few hours, optimism flickered. Then counterattacks came: shells, gas, bayonets in the dark, and the line settled again, sometimes a little forward, sometimes exactly where it had been before. Progress was a cruel illusion. The war underground grew more literal as well. Mining operations tunneled beneath enemy trenches, packing chambers with explosives to obliterate entire sections of the line. When mines detonated, the earth itself seemed to erupt. Craters large enough to swallow buildings appeared instantly. Men nearby were thrown like dolls. Others were buried alive, entombed in silence. It was warfare reduced to its most primal form: dig, wait, destroy. Technology kept intruding. New weapons arrived with promises of breakthrough: flamethrowers that turned trenches into ovens, grenades designed for close combat, mortars lobbed death into places rifles couldn't reach. Each innovation was terrifying for about a week. Then soldiers adapted. They always adapted, because adaptation was the only alternative to dying. And through it all, time dragged on. Months passed, seasons changed, mud froze, then thawed again. Men marked time not by dates, but by offensives: before the Somme, after Ypres, during that terrible winter when everything collapsed. The world outside the trenches felt unreal, like a half-remembered dream. Letters from home arrived sporadically. They spoke of normal things: harvests, births, shortages, optimism. They were meant to comfort, and sometimes they did. Other times they made the distance feel unbearable. How could the same world contain both this and that? At night, when the guns paused, some soldiers stared at the stars. The same stars they'd seen as children. The same stars shining over their homes. It was a small comfort, a reminder that something existed beyond the trench walls, beyond the wire, beyond the war. When the air turned against you. At some point, someone decided the ground was not enough. The trenches were holding. The wire was holding. The men, astonishingly, were still holding. So the war reached for the air itself, and quietly, almost politely at first, turned it into a weapon. Gas did not arrive with an explosion. It drifted. That was the truly unsettling part. a low, rolling cloud creeping across no man's land, catching in shell holes, sliding into trenches like a living thing. Greenish, yellow, sometimes almost invisible depending on the light. At first, some soldiers thought it was smoke, meant to cover an attack. They leaned over parapets to watch it approach. That mistake did not last long. Chlorine burned the lungs. Phosgene was worse, slower, crueler. You could breathe it in, think you were fine, then drown hours later as your lungs filled with fluid. Later still came mustard gas, which didn't even bother to kill you quickly. It blistered skin, blinded eyes, lingered in the soil for days. It punished curiosity, punished carelessness, punished anyone unlucky enough to be downwind. Gas masks became constant companions, crude at first, cloth pads soaked in chemicals, then more sophisticated designs with filters and glass eyepieces that fogged at the worst possible moments. Wearing one was suffocating. Taking it off was a gamble. A man coughing beside you might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. Gas didn't end trench warfare, it just added another layer of fear. Another way the war invaded the most basic human function, breathing. You could avoid bullets by staying low, you could avoid shells by hiding deep, but air was unavoidable, and the knowledge that even that could betray you wore men down in ways commanders rarely acknowledged. While gas seeped into the trenches, generals planned offensives on a scale never seen before. If small attacks failed, then surely enormous ones would succeed. Enough men, enough guns, enough shells. The logic was relentless, mathematics applied to human lives. The Somme was one of those moments where logic met reality and lost badly. A week-long artillery barrage was meant to destroy German defenses entirely. The earth shook, the sky glowed. Shells fell so densely that soldiers swore the ground itself was moving. When the guns finally stopped, men climbed out of their trenches believing, or perhaps needing to believe, that nothing could have survived. They were wrong. German defenders emerged from deep dugouts, shaken but alive. Machine guns were ready. When the attacking lines advanced, walking at a measured pace because that was what training demanded, the guns opened up. Tens of thousands fell in a single day, not because they were cowards, not because they lacked discipline, but because courage is meaningless against a weapon designed to kill continuously. And yet, the attacks continued, day after day, week after week. Villages were reduced to names on maps. Forests vanished. Rivers changed course. The front line crept forward almost imperceptibly, fed by blood. By the time it ended, the Somme had consumed over 1 million casualties, for ground you could walk across in minutes. This pattern repeated itself across the Western Front. Verdun, Ypres, Passchendaele, each became shorthand for suffering, for mud so deep men drowned standing up, for rain that never seemed to stop, for shelling so constant that silence felt unnatural. Passchendaele in particular was a lesson in stubbornness. Attacks launched into a landscape that had ceased to function as land. Shelling destroyed drainage systems. Rain filled craters until the ground became a sucking swamp. Men, horses, guns disappeared into it. The wounded sank slowly, sometimes calling for help until the mud filled their mouths. Still, the orders came. Advance, hold, advance again. Why didn't they stop? It's a question that haunts every trench war narrative. The easy answer is incompetence. The harder, truer answer is momentum. Once nations committed millions of men, once losses reached unfathomable numbers, stopping felt like admitting that all of it had been for nothing. So, leaders doubled down. Surely the next push would break the line. Surely endurance would be rewarded. Down in the trenches, soldiers stopped thinking in those terms. Survival became personal, immediate. You worried about the next shell, not the war's outcome. You worried about whether the duckboards would hold your weight, whether your friend would still be alive in the morning, whether the rats would leave anything untouched. Shell shock became impossible to ignore. Men froze mid-step, shook uncontrollably, wept without knowing why. Some ran, some simply sat down and refused to move. Punishments were harsh at first. Cowardice, they said. Later, reluctantly, armies began to understand that the human mind had limits, but understanding came slowly and often too late. Even rest was uneasy. Soldiers rotated out of the line, but the rear areas were still under shell fire. There was no true safety anywhere near the front. Sleep came shallow and broken. Dreams, when they came, were often worse than waking life. And yet, amid all this, life persisted. Men formed routines, rituals, superstitions, a certain cigarette before stand to, a lucky coin kept in a pocket, letters reread until the paper softened, songs hummed quietly in dugouts. Humanity adapted, stubbornly, even here. As the war dragged on, new solutions were tested. Tanks lumbered onto the battlefield, awkward and unreliable, but promising something different, a way to cross wire, to survive machine gun fire. They broke down often, got stuck in mud, terrified the enemy when they worked. They were imperfect, but they hinted at change. Still, for most soldiers, the trench was their world, a narrow strip of earth that defined existence. Forward meant danger, back meant exhaustion, up meant death, down meant mud. When the earth finally let go. By 1918, the war was tired. Not in the poetic sense, not the kind of tired that leads to reflection or wisdom. It was the exhausted, hollowed-out kind. The kind where even violence feels repetitive. The trenches were still there, of course, they always were. But something had changed in the air, and not the poisonous kind this time. The certainty that this could go on forever had cracked. Years of stalemate had drained armies and nations alike. Men were older now, hardened, less romantic. They no longer spoke about victory with excitement, but with a sort of grim accounting. How much more would it cost? How many more names would be written in letters home? How many more winters the trenches could endure before they simply collapsed into the ground entirely? The old offensives had taught painful lessons. Walking slowly into machine gun fire did not work. Endless artillery barrages warned the enemy instead of destroying them. So tactics evolved, not out of brilliance, but necessity. Shorter bombardments, surprise, coordination between infantry, artillery, aircraft, and tanks. The war learned, slowly, awkwardly, how to move again. When the lines finally began to break, they did so unevenly, not with a single dramatic collapse, but with a series of cracks. Units pulled back, trenches were abandoned. Men advanced into territory that felt unfamiliar simply because it was open. Fields without wire, villages without front lines. For soldiers who had lived underground for years, the open sky felt almost threatening. The fighting was still brutal, make no mistake about that. Retreats were chaotic, counterattacks were fierce, artillery still thundered. But the rhythm had changed. The war was no longer frozen, it was flowing again, and that terrified commanders almost as much as stalemate once had. Movement meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant loss of control. For the men on the ground, liberation from the trenches did not feel like triumph. It felt like disorientation. Trench warfare had been horrific, but it had also been predictable in its own way. You knew where the danger was. You knew where to hide. Now danger could come from anywhere. A machine gun in a ruined farmhouse, a shell from beyond the horizon. The open ground demanded new instincts. Then, suddenly, almost awkwardly, it ended. Not with a final charge, not with a climactic battle worthy of the suffering that preceded it, but with silence. Orders not to advance, orders not to fire. Men standing in trenches, or what remained of them, listening to a quiet that felt unreal. Some cheered, some cried, some just sat down, unsure what to do next. The trenches did not vanish when the war ended. They stayed, lines carved into the earth, slowly filling with water, weeds, memory. Farmers would later uncover bones while plowing fields. Helmets would surface after heavy rain. The ground remembered what had happened, even when people tried to forget. And forgetting was tempting. After the war, nations struggled to explain what trench warfare had been for. Monuments rose. Names were carved into stone in numbers too large to feel personal. Words like honor and sacrifice were used carefully, sometimes desperately, as if language itself could justify the mud, the gas, the waiting, the years lost underground. But trench warfare left a deeper legacy than monuments. It reshaped how humanity thought about war itself. The illusion of glorious, short conflicts was shattered. Industrialized killing had revealed its true face. Progress, it turned out, could make suffering more efficient without making it meaningful. For those who survived, the trenches never fully disappeared. They lived on in habits, in sudden silences, in the inability to sleep without listening for sounds that were no longer there. The war had trained their senses in ways peace never quite reversed. And for those who did not survive, the trenches became their final geography. Not heroes frozen in dramatic poses, but men who slipped, waited, froze, drowned, burned, and endured until endurance ran out. Ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances, asked to survive something no human nervous system was designed to endure. When you look at photographs of trench warfare now, the scale is hard to grasp. Endless lines of earthworks, tiny figures swallowed by landscape. It feels distant, historical, safe. But for those who lived it, the trench was not history, it was the entire world. 8 feet wide, a few feet deep, bounded by mud walls and fear. And maybe that is the quiet truth trench warfare leaves us with. That war, when stripped of speeches and symbols, becomes small, narrow, repetitive. Not grand movements of nations, but long nights of waiting. Not heroic charges, but stubborn survival. Not glory, but endurance measured in hours. So as the guns fade, and the mud settles, and the earth slowly reclaims what was carved into it, we're left with a question that history never fully answers. If this was progress, what did it progress toward? The trenches are gone now, mostly. Fields grow where men once hid. Roads cross where no man's land once swallowed lives. The world moves on as it always does, but somewhere beneath the soil, the shape of the trenches remains, faint but persistent, a reminder that the ground itself once learned how to hold a war. And maybe that is the quiet truth trench warfare leaves us with. That war, when stripped of speeches and symbols, becomes small, narrow, repetitive. Not grand movements of nations, but long nights of waiting. Not heroic charges, but stubborn survival. Not glory, but endurance measured in hours. So as the guns fade, and the mud settles, and the earth slowly reclaims what was carved into it, we're left with a question that history never fully answers. If this was progress, what did it progress toward? The trenches are gone now, mostly. Fields grow where men once hid. Roads cross where no man's land once swallowed lives. The world moves on as it always does, but somewhere beneath the soil, the shape of the trenches remains, faint but persistent, a reminder that the ground itself once learned how to hold a war. And maybe that is the quiet truth trench warfare leaves us with. That war, when stripped of speeches and symbols, becomes small, narrow, repetitive, not grand movements of nations, but long nights of waiting, not heroic charges, but stubborn survival, not glory, but endurance measured in hours. So as the guns fade, and the mud settles, and the earth slowly reclaims what was carved into it, we're left with a question that history never fully answers. If this was progress, what did it progress toward?